Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today I'm making an heirloom style baby gown. Now, somewhat uncharacteristically, I am starting without a complete plan. This dress is going on a reborn baby doll, and the doll is pretty small, so I need a newborn pattern. However, the design I've come up with has a fully smocked bodice, and that is a style that is normally done on larger sizes. I do have a workaround for that, but first I have to pick my fabric. I had this white cotton voile left from a previous project. It is too sheer for most garments, but I think I can get away with it for a baby dress. After ironing it, I went to cut it out, and I'm just cutting rectangles here. I used the Children's Corner Sutton Pattern to determine the length, because my original plan was to make this somewhat longer, like a baby gown, more so than just a dress. However, this didn't end up really working because I had to shorten my rectangles because I didn't straighten out the one edge before I cut the rectangles, so it ended up shorter than I wanted it. And I am cutting the full width of the fabric and then trimming off the selvage edge. So that was the front piece, and I cut basically the same for the back, though I used the front to make sure I had the right length. And with this one, I did cut it in half so that I had two pieces. Then I pulled out my pleating machine to pleat all three of these pieces. I used the Bodice pattern piece from the Sarah Classic Sewing ribbon dress pattern to get the shape that I needed. So I am using that pattern to determine how many rows I needed to pleat. And I just pleated all three pieces one after the other to avoid having to rethread all of the needles on my pleater. My rectangles weren't cut as straight as I thought, so as I pulled them off the pleater, I pulled out some of the threads so that I ended up like with a straight edge where the pleating threads were. And then I used the rotary cutter to try and straighten out those edges. That didn't work as well as I would have liked, but at least I tried. So for the front piece, after I had straightened out the edge, all I had to do was tie it off to the correct width, which was based on that pattern piece that I showed earlier. For the back pieces, as I pulled them off, I had to take on one of the edges and pull out the pleating threads so that a 1/4 of an inch would lay flat before pulling them to the correct size and tying them off as well. After they were the proper size, I evened out the pleats and went to the ironing board to steam all of the pieces. Now for the smocking. I used white metallic thread and began by smocking the front using a 4-step 1-row wave. I repeated this for all the rows, creating a diamond design. Now this part of the panel is going to be cut into the shape of the bodice pattern from earlier. So I cut a copy of that pattern from freezer paper, and as I smocked, I checked the shape of that piece against the panel. This allowed me to see what would be cut away and not to have to smock the full rows in some of the areas. But even with that bit of time saving, this still ended up taking 2 days to complete. Granted, they weren't full days of smocking, but I still couldn't quite justify doing that for the back, which was basically the same size as the front. However, the back panels were already pleated, so what I decided to do was to back smock those two panels with cable stitches. This allowed me to keep the pleats, but to theoretically cut down on the amount of smocking that needed to be done. It didn't end up saving me much time, but it was a much easier process to do because there wasn't as much to have to pay attention to as far as the design went. After all of the panels were smocked, I went back to the ironing board and steamed them again before removing the pleating threads. When I did this, the panel stretched out a bit. I think I had a little too wide of fabric, and that's what caused that to happen. It also means I didn't have to smock quite as much as I actually did. I took the freezer paper cutouts and placed them on the back of the panels with the shiny side down. For the front piece, I made sure that it was placed entirely over the smocking. Then I ironed the paper onto the fabric. I did the same for the back panels, this time lining the center back seam with the edge of the smocking on that side where I had a flat edge. I set my sewing machine to a short, narrow zigzag stitch and sewed as close to the edge of the freezer paper along the side, shoulder, neckline, and center back seams. Then I cut the bodice shape out using the freezer paper as a guide before removing it. And now it's starting to look more like a dress. And I sewed these pieces together at the shoulder seams. Now for the sleeves. I used one of the sleeve patterns from the ribbon dress, but I folded up the edge to straighten out the hem. Then I added entredot followed by lace to that edge. Now the sleeves were ready to be gathered and attached to the dress, and then the side seams sewn. I wanted a ruffle collar for the neckline, so I took this double scalloped lace and trimmed down one of the edges so that I had a straight edge. Then gathered it up and attached it to the neckline. I used bias binding to finish the neckline by first sewing it on, then wrapping it around and whip stitching it in place on the back. Now technically, because I did not turn this all the way under, I should have trimmed away the seam allowance to avoid making the neckline too small. But since this is going on a doll, this is less of a concern and possibly even a benefit, since there is a difference in how baby clothes fit on dolls. And when I stitched down the neckline, I also turned the center back edges under and stitched them in place as well. I back smocked the bottom 2 rows of the bodice front to help hold the pleats in place while I did some embroidery. I initially had fairly elaborate plans for the embroidery, but as I was looking at the dress at this point, I decided it would be better to kind of dial it back a little and go with something more simple. So I embroidered light pink bullion roses in the middle of each of the diamonds on the last row. And because my roses really look like flowers by themselves, I added light green leaves using a lazy daisy stitch on either side of each rose. With the bodice embellishments finished, I moved on to the skirt. First, I turned up and pressed the hem in place. This way I could just see where it was going to end, and this is where I had to decide on the length and decided to go with more of a dress and less of a gown. Then I attached a pink ribbon just above the top of the hem. And I took some eyelet lace and sewed it on over the ribbon, positioning it so that the color of the ribbon showed through the eyelets of the lace. Now I'm sewing the center back skirt seam, then I secured the hem by hand using a whip stitch. And for the back closure, I just attached buttons on one side and sewed button loops on the other. I took the same pink ribbon from the skirt and wove it through the eyelets of the sleeve bands. This way I can kind of use the ribbon to gather up the sleeves to the necessary size and then tie them into bows. I had planned to add a bonnet but thought that might be a bit too much, so instead I took some of the eyelet lace and some of the ribbon, which I attached to the back of the lace, leaving a long tail on either end with the ribbon. This way it could be tied on as a headband. And here's the finished dress. Normally when I do projects like this, I have like a long list of things that I wish I had done differently. But in this case, there is nothing that I would change. Because it's so thin, I paired it with a slip made from a shortened version of the slip view from the Sutton Pattern, and a diaper cover that was a free pattern from madeeveryday.com. And I will link all of these patterns in the description. And now it is time to try it on a doll.